teachers of other disciplines across the country and abroad. To all the senior professors of philosophy to be connected with us in this Sunday webinar. Today we will have a very beautiful topic, and we have with us a speaker, a stalwart in philosophy, a very senior professor of philosophy of our country, Professor S. Paneerselvam, the former professional head, Department of Philosophy, Madras University. I extend my pranam to Paneerselvam sir to accept our invitation to be with us in this Sunday webinar. Today we have a very beautiful topic, that is contextualizing Indian historiography in Professor S. Barlingay. You know, Professor Barlingay is an Indian logician, and he happens to be Marathi. He did his PhD in philosophy. Once upon a time, he was the chair of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy in Delhi University. He introduced the concept of genie analysis in philosophy. He has taken up many enterprises to re-understand Indian philosophy. For him, Indian philosophy is a kind of system building, and philosophy the analysis of ordinary language, and many more things that Professor S.S. Barlingay has reflected in his writings, and all the things will be reflected and will be presented by our senior professor S. Paneerselvam. I don't want to reflect upon many more things because I'm ignorant of the philosophy of Professor Barlingay. Today we will listen philosophy of Professor Barlingay from Professor Paneerselvam. We are eagerly waiting him. But before inviting Professor Paneerselvam to this Sunday webinar to speak upon the particular subject, let me give a brief introduction on Professor Paneerselvam's enterprise on philosophy regarding his educational journey. Professor Selvam, has published more than 33 publications in Indian and in international journals, and he has published many papers both in national and international journals. He has participated many were seminars, workshops, and conferences. It is not possible to reflect upon all things. And he has organized a number of workshops and seminars. His area of interest, area of specialization includes non-Western philosophy, contemporary philosophy, traditional and contemporary Oriental philosophy, postmodernism, philosophy of language, cross-cultural hermeneutics, and many more things. And Professor Paneerselvam is a very active member of IPC, and he has contributed a lot to IPC. He has taken many initiatives to introduce new courses in philosophy in different autonomous colleges and universities in our country. He has encouraged the scholars of philosophy to take new topics and for their philosophizing. And he has many more things, many more contributions for philosophical reflection for the new generation. And Professor Paneerselvam is associated with many philosophical forums of this country. Because of the paucity of time, I don't want to recite all the things. And he has also obtained many more awards. That is the award of Indo-Canadian Shastri Institute, Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade Institute. And he has been associated with the advisory committee of many philosophical forums and other forums. He has visited many more countries like Paris and other countries for cultural exchange and philosophical reflection, philosophical exchange. I don't want to also reflect all the things. So simply we are here to listen to him on the philosophy of Barlingay that he has done research, particular research in that area. I extend my hearty welcome to Professor Barlingay. I extend my regard to him to be connected today. I extend my welcome to Professor Pramod Kumar Das, the host and convener of Philosophy family. Today he is with us, and today he will be also moderating the question and answer session in the absence of Dr. K. Umnan Rao. I welcome, once again, welcome all the teachers and scholars of philosophy to this webinar, this Sunday webinar, and I request our revered teacher of teachers, Professor Paneerselvam, to commence his speech on the scheduled topic. Over to Paneerselvam, sir.
Thank you. Most respected Professor Pramod Kumar Das ji, Professor Om Narayan Rao, Professor Maharana, my good friend and one of the important philosophers of this country, Professor Dilip Mohanta ji, Professor Avinash Srivatsava, Professor Ranjit Ghosh, my good friend Professor Shamshiv Prasad, my friend from Sri Lanka Jagannathan, Professor Badri, and others. At the outset, I am grateful to the philosophy community or philosophy family for organizing so many webinars on various themes of philosophy. In fact, from 2020 onwards, so far they have conducted 342 webinars. Every week there will be a program organized by Professor Dash and his colleagues. And also the proceedings of these webinars have been brought out in two interesting volumes. And besides this, they are also doing an excellent service to the student community by preparing the students and young teachers for many competitive exams in philosophy. So the great contribution of Professor Dash and his colleagues is something remarkable, and I salute him for doing a wonderful service to philosophy. And this platform we use in order to share our knowledge, in order to share our views with other colleagues who are great teachers of philosophy, senior teachers of philosophy. And from them also we learn a lot. So this platform gives us an opportunity to discuss many of the philosophical themes, both Indian and Western. 2 months ago, I delivered a lecture in the philosophy family on Richard Rorty. Hope some of you would remember that lecture. So in continuation of that, today I would like to discuss with you one of the great philosophers of recent Indian philosophy, that is Professor Surendra Shidos Barlingay, affectionately known as S.S. Barlingay. Born on 20th July 1919, he has contributed immensely for the progress of philosophy, and he died on December 1997. And who is Professor Barlingay? This is a question which many of the young teachers of philosophy would ask, because some of them may not be familiar with this name Barlingay, but some of us had a very close association with Professor S.S. Barlingay, sir. Who is Professor Barlingay? He is a professor of philosophy, educationalist, journalist, social reformer, political activist, freedom fighter, and whatnot. His philosophical contributions are something remarkable because he was well versed both in Indian as well as Western philosophical tradition. Especially Western logic, he could apply to Indian logic, and his work on modern introduction to Indian logic is something very important which has to be mentioned in this context. And he was inspired by eminent scholars like G.R. Malkani, Rajbihari Das, and many others. And also he taught at various universities. He started his philosophical teaching or career at Sri Venkateshwara University, Tirupati. Then he was teaching in Delhi University, then Pune University, and many other foreign universities. He was also the head of the Department of Philosophy, Pune University, wherein he could build the department in a beautiful way. He could appoint great scholars like R. Sundarajan and made the department as a very active, philosophically active one. So he is a one who has revived the philosophical tradition in India, especially his contribution to Indian Institute of Philosophy at Amalner is something very important, which has to be mentioned here. And also he was mainly responsible for starting two important journals in philosophy. One is Indian Philosophical Quarterly, which is very important, and also Paramarsha Journal in Hindi. This contribution of his contribution to philosophy thus is something remarkable. And also he has written both in English as well as in Marathi, and his Marathi writings is always very famous among the Marathi scholars. And I would like to mention some of his important books. For example, A Modern Introduction to Indian Logic, which I mentioned just now. This book was published in the year 1975. And later, Belief, Reasons and Reflections, published in 1983. Then Poverty, Power and Progress, published in 1983 once again. Then Critical History of Western Philosophy from Bacon to Kant. And then a critical survey of research in philosophical journals. And also, he has given his philosophical journey in his well-known work, Confessions and Commitments. This is a philosophical journey of Professor Barlingay, who will be remembered forever for his contribution to both Indian and Western philosophical tradition. And I would like to mention some of his works in which we can see a significant contribution to philosophy. For example, his work on Modern Introduction to Indian Ethics deals with the Indian moral problems and concepts, wherein he deals with concepts like morality, virtues, and values. And his comments in this book, his comments on philosophy is very interesting. He says, to me, philosophy is a cultural activity or cultural discipline. And further he says that Indian culture is a rainbow culture where we see a synthesis of different cultures. And further he says that the world along with God is valuable, and the world bereft of God is worthless. This is what he says in this well-known book, Modern Introduction to Indian Ethics. And another important work which I mentioned just now is a critical survey of Western philosophy, starting from Bacon onwards to Kant, wherein he talks about the distinction that exists between philosophy and science. And he says, while defining science, he says, it is a positive description of a part of reality, right? Whereas philosophy is a critical interpretation of the whole of reality. This is how he makes a distinction between philosophy and science. Similarly, his well-known work, Re-Understanding of Indian Philosophy, of course, this is a posthumous publication, which contains 23 important research papers of Professor Barlingay sir, wherein he talks about the need for re-understanding or reinterpreting Indian philosophical tradition. This is one of the best books of Professor S.S. Barlingay, according to me. Then he has written another important work, which I mentioned just now, that is Poverty, Power, Progress, wherein he talks about poverty, power, democracy, justice, and Sarvodaya. And he tries to understand the problem of poverty under three heads. One is production, second is modernization, and third is education. And for the eradication of poverty, he says that there should be a total change in the cultural and social outlook. And he says by this, we can make tremendous progress. And this book is very, very important for the main reason that he talks about two important models, which are very fascinating. These models are known as the funnel model and the net model. Now, what is this funnel model? He says, I quote him, when we pour some liquid through a funnel, it goes through a smaller outlet of the funnel. Although the liquid may contain several molecules and atoms, the behavior of these different molecules are canalized and directed in one particular way. He says that in this funnel model, the manyness or plurality is forgotten. One takes the supreme position and others are reduced to nothing, or others are reduced to that of slaves. So he will not accept this funnel model. On the other hand, he prescribes the net model, wherein he says a society, human society, is like that of a net of a fisherman. What does this mean? This means, he says, the net is woven with several knots, and the individual in a society is compared to these knots. And in a net, these knots are connected. They are like the individual, how one individual is connected to the individual. Here he says, the pluralism is recognized and the existence of the other is recognized. So this net model, according to Barlingay, is very much valuable for human society because it takes into account the significance of the other. Now, this is a very important methodology which he prescribes for understanding human society. This means the other, which is the notion of other, which is playing a very important role in the postmodern understanding, was very much anticipated by Professor Barlingay. Because only in the postmodern tradition or in the continental tradition, we talk about the role of other, especially in the writings of Levinas and others. But prior to that, in Indian philosophical tradition, we come across a great thinker like Barlingay, who has talked about the significance of the other. This another interesting book has a title, A Modern Introduction to Indian Aesthetic Theory, wherein he traces the development of aesthetics from Bharata to Jagannatha. And another important work of Barlingay is Confessions and Commitment, where he explains his philosophical development. He shows that man is the center of everything. He says, my philosophical activity starts with the human being. And he further says, philosophy basically is anthropocentric in nature, which means for him, a philosophy which fails to talk about man or human being is not at all philosophy. So his first work in Marathi was published when he was in underground movement. Writing on this, Professor R. Balasubramaniam, because for this book, Confessions and Commitment, R. Balasubramaniam, when he was the chairman of ICPR, writes the foreword, in which Professor R. Balasubramaniam states like this. He says, normally, social activity and political activity do not fall within the framework of academic philosophy. This means for academic philosophers, the social work as well as the political activity are not that much important. But R. Balasubramanian says, in the writings of Barlingay, the approach is something different. He was an academic philosopher, at the same time involved himself in political activity as well as social work. And his independent thinking is something remarkable. And this phase or this approach of Barlingay was appreciated by thinkers like Daya Krishna, Rajendra Prasad, D.P. Chattopadhyaya, Sundararajan, and many others. So in this book, The Confessions and Commitment, he says for him, philosophy means philosophizing. So he says philosophy is a substantive term used for philosophizing. So he considers philosophy as a movement. It is a thinking continuum. He says it is a thinking continuum. So he is of the view that if philosophers stop analyzing, right, what would happen? He says, if philosophers stop analyzing, then things would have been different, right? But at the same time, he says, while trying to reconstruct many of the philosophical concepts, philosophers also try to misuse the categories. For example, he says, we misuse the categories of distinguishable and separable, existence and assertions of existence, cosmocentric and anthropocentric. These are the concepts which are quite often misunderstood or misinterpreted by philosophers. In fact, in one of his books, he has a very beautiful article. The title is Distinguishable and Separable. So he says philosopher is very much essential in order to reconstruct the world, but at the same time, they are mistaking the categories. The category mistake which Gilbert Ryle and others talk about is very much emphasized by our great Professor Barlingay. Now, one of the interesting, I would be focusing on, just now I gave a brief account of all his writings, some significant aspects of his writings, but I would be mainly concentrating on one of his interesting essays. It is titled like this, History, Historical Being and Historiography. And my main concentration would be on this important article wherein he talks about the significance of historiography. And this article is compiled in his well-known book, Beliefs, Reasons and Reflections. This book, which contains number of articles of Barlingay sir, are thought-provoking and stimulating for the main reason that it gives different approaches to philosophical problems. Especially this article, History, Historical Being and Historiography, gives a new dimension to historiography. I have titled my essay as Contextualizing Historiography of Professor Barlingay for the main reason that keeping his philosophical discourse on historiography at the backdrop, one can analyze some of the modern theories of historiography, especially Foucault and others, and we try to see how far one can see these aspects in his writing. So what is his approach to historiography? He says that it is very much essential for us to contextualize the philosophical discourse. So which means it is not the duty of the philosophers to say something and then vanish. How the philosophical problems are interrelated with human society. So which means all philosophical problems must be contextualized. So this is the uniqueness of his writing. And he here in this essay, he makes a distinction between history, then historical being, and historiography. Now, what is history? For him, history, he defines history like this. History is man's continuous effort to modify nature. So when man makes an effort to modify nature, that is history. And he says, man whose existence is temporal in nature thus becomes a historical being. Because man's existence is not permanent, it is only temporal. So what is the significance of man and his existence is nothing but a historical being. So his approach to historiography thus throws light on some of the great contributions made by thinkers like Barlingay Tilak, right? Nehru, Kosambi, Lohia from a different perspective. So these are some of the scholars or thinkers who are discussed in his philosophical discourse with regard to historiography. So one can develop or one can emphasize the need for promoting or developing what is known as Indian historiography. Because normally when we talk about historiography, we talk the term historiography in terms of the West. That's why we quite often say that it is a high time for us to decolonize Indian philosophical tradition. Most of the times we borrow Western terms, we try to understand Western philosophy in our own way, thus neglecting the great contribution made by our own thinkers. That is the reason why long back, K.C. Bhattacharya has written a very beautiful article on Swaraj in Ideas published by the Vishwabharati University. So it is very much essential for us to read or reread some of the great contributions made by our own thinkers with regard to historiography. So we can say it is nothing but Indian historiography. For example, he says that Tilak's Gita Rahasya has to be taken seriously by philosophers of India. Why? Because most of the time we consider that it is nothing but the commentary on Gita. But Barlingay says that it has to be seen from a different perspective. He says Gita Rahasya of Tilak represents the interpretational approach, and it reflects the Indian historiography, which has to be taken seriously by Indian philosophers. But unfortunately, he says Indian philosophers simply consider that as a commentary to Bhagavad Gita. And further, he says the time, dialectics, and the intersubjectivity are the three important factors which shape human beings' historicity. So the history of man gives the ability to look the past from the present and plan for the future. This is how one can understand history. We look at the past and then we try to build up our future by living in present. So the historicity of man gives him a dimension with regard to the past and also a dimension to the future. Based on our past errors or past mistakes, one can build up a future society. This means for Barlingay, the basic assumption is that there are certain inner links between the concept of historical being, history, and historiography. And he says, he also wants, 1 minute, sorry. He also wants to find out whether there are some laws governing history. And it is in this context, we have to analyze some of the interesting features which he has emphasized with regard to historiography. And he says, human being is a historical being, which means human being is always placed in history, whether he likes it or not. So in order to explain this concept, he makes a distinction between the happening on the one side and action on the other, and says that action is very much essential because action always demands the existence of the author and it must be a real one. So the author, that is the agent, individual agent, takes the responsibility of action. And he says the source of action must be the author himself. And in order to understand this, he talks about two important points, or he talks about how this could be understood. That is, first of all, he says the author must be a living one, a living being, having consciousness. So it is the author who is a real agent, and the author cannot be separated from that of the action. And in order to understand this, we must understand the fact that author is a living being having consciousness, and secondly, that the author must be conscious that is consciousness. It is this second consciousness which he calls as a self-consciousness, which gives him the identity, and it is that which gives him a place in the universe. So this means it is self-consciousness which makes a man the maker of history or the historical being. So this is his unique contribution with regard to Indian historiography. Similarly, one can raise a question whether he is talking about the traditional historiography or modern historiography. Because there are two ways of understanding historiography. One is the traditional way of understanding history, wherein it is said that what is already there is something permanent and it cannot change. So the future is always based on the past, so no new change would emerge. This is a traditional approach to history. And there is also another way of understanding history, that is a modern approach to history, wherein it is said that the traditional notion of history can always be questioned, because one can see how in modern historiography there is always a progress. It expects man to perform some action for the betterment of the society. So this distinction is very much essential. The traditional way of understanding history, or traditional historiography, or modern historiography. And the modern historiography, I would like to use the phrase of the postmodern understanding, wherein it is said a new methodology is very much essential in order to see how historiography has different dimensions. In this context, in order to show the distinction between the traditional and modern or postmodern historiography, I would like to use the methodology adopted by Foucault, and then I'll try to apply this to Indian context, because I already said I'm contextualizing the writings of Professor Barlingay. So let us see how the postmodern historiography is discussed in Foucault. Then we shall see whether this approach is acceptable to Professor Barlingay. Foucault, all of us know, is a very well-known postmodern thinker. He made a detailed study of historiography, and he says that from the time of Greek, we can see, from the time of Greek up to 20th century, we can see only the traditional historiography. And he says, in this traditional historiography, there is no place for the other. It rejects or ignores history of the oppressed and the backward and the colonized people. This is the approach made by the traditional historiography, according to Foucault. And this, he said, has happened from the time of the Greeks up to the 20th century. So this means one has to reject the traditional method of historiography, and then we have to move towards modern form of history writing, which is emphasized by Foucault. Now, the uniqueness of this postmodern historiography is that it rejects the European colonization. And it is said that in this methodology, there is always a transcendence, which means there is what we call the pluralistic view of history. It is not the conventional history or the traditional history in which we find thinkers like Hegel, who talked about the conventional history. But here, in the pluralistic view of history, we see that there is a discontinuity in history. In traditional historiography, there is always a continuity and conjuncture, which means all traditional historians or historiographers believed that history is one and it is continuous. There is no break. But the postmodern historiography talks about the break in history. So which means there is always discontinuity, which means there are gaps in history which we have to take into account. So this approach gives a space for the oppressed and the suppressed, and also the neglected people. So by rejecting the traditional historiography, Foucault develops a concept otherwise known as subjugated knowledge. So what is subjugated knowledge? It is a form of knowledge which has been subjugated or buried under the official or dominant forms of knowledge. Now, one example I would give in this context is subjugated knowledge. Because knowledge, for example, we think that knowledge which a computer engineer possesses is something great. Whereas the knowledge of the carpenter or an artist or a plumber is not taken so seriously. This is what we call the subjugated knowledge. So, as a part of the colonial project, the ways of knowing science, history, and government have been buried. By saying that this is subjugated knowledge, we neglect the role of the ordinary people. Edward Said is a well-known thinker whom I would like to mention here. Edward Said has applied the Foucauldian ideas to the colonial practice in his well-known book, Orientalism. And he says how the colonial practice was based on the construction of Oriental people being less civilized than the people of the West. Because Edward Said is a very, very important thinker, because he makes a distinction between the Western people and the Oriental people, and how the Oriental people were subjugated. And he makes the binary opposite, which is always prevalent. What is that? On the one side, you have Western people. On the other side, let us say you have the Oriental people. The Western people are, it is said, right? It is said they are civilized, whereas the Oriental people are barbarous, right? The Western people are active, it is said, whereas the Oriental people are passive. One is progressive, that is the Western people are progressive, it is said, and whereas the Oriental people, it is said, are backward. And Western people are subjects of knowledge, whereas the colonized people or Oriental people are objects of knowledge. Western people are individuated, whereas Oriental people are unindividuated. Now, this distinction of Edward Said, which he has developed from Foucault, clearly shows that there is a distinction between the colonizer and the colonized. So what type of historiography one can develop from this? Because when the European write the historiography, they neglect the role of the other, they neglect the significance of the other, and as a result of that, there is a wide distinction between the colonizer and the colonized. So what I would like to say is that there are two ways of understanding historiography. One is the traditional approach to historiography, wherein it is said the past is something very precious, it has to preserve, and what would happen in future is nothing but the repetition of the past. On the other hand, the modern historiography or the Western historiography or the postmodern historiography gives a different dimension. It cancels the conventional type of historiography and says that history is not one continuous event. There are breaks. So we have to take into account the role played by the other, the role played by the colonized people, and the oppressed people and the suppressed people, women and their role. All this must be taken into account. So this means while writing the historiography, a new methodology has to be followed. And this methodology, according to Barlingay, is very much prevalent in the writings of Tilak. I'll come to that. But now I remember I raised a question. Where do we place Barlingay? Barlingay, of course, was not aware of Foucault, I think. So we can't expect him that you should follow the modern historiography or the postmodern historiography. But he is not a mere traditionalist. Though he appreciates the significance of the tradition, he also points out that there is a need to transcend wherever and whenever necessary. This is very much visible in his writing, especially when he wrote a book, Re-Understanding Indian Philosophy. He shows that if there are certain concepts which are not relevant, then it is high time for us to reject those concepts. So this is very much essential in order to relate this with his way of understanding historiography. So historiography, according to him, especially Indian historiography, according to him, has some novel aspects which one has to take into account. So he is also talking about the dialectic of history, and he says that history is something which nourishes a human being, and we have to recast some of his views on historiography in the postmodern context so that one can see the relevance of his Indian historiography. Now here, I would like to show that there are three kinds of historiography, and let us see where do we place Barlingay. One is the historiography of power, and second is the historiography as reason, and three as vision. And here, two questions can be raised. One is what kind of historiography is talking about. Now, where do we locate his theory, that is his way of understanding historiography? Is he talking about historiography as power, or is talking about history as reason or as vision? This is a very important question which one has to consider, because his writing clearly show that he could synthesize, right? He could synthesize all the three. In his writing, you can see that historiography is understood as power and as a vision, because he, being an Indian philosopher, uses this concept, and also as a reason, and also reason. So all these three kinds of historiography are very much found in the writings of S.S. Barlingay. And when we are talking about historiography, one important pertinent question that arises is this: is there something called authentic history or authentic historicity, which Heidegger and others speak? Now, the question one can make a counter question here: who decides what is authentic and what is inauthentic? So this is a question which has perhaps has to be taken into account while reading the writings of Barlingay with regard to historiography. Because I am making a critical assessment of his writing. I am not here simply to celebrate his writings, because he won't like it. I know that very much, because he wants all his writings all his speeches should be critically evaluated. So I would like to do that. And another question which I would like to raise here is, whose historiography is he talking about? This is something very important. But we can find an answer to this question, because he says that human being is a progressive humanist. So when he talks about the progressive humanist or progressive humanism, it is very clear that he moves away from the traditional way of understanding historiography and goes towards the modern historiography, wherein he talks about the progress of man. The progressive humanist is the approach made by him in order to show how the modern historiography could be understood. So this methodology of Barlingay has to be taken seriously in order to contextualize him. Another question which I would like to raise here is, one can understand historiography in this way also. There are three types of historiography, another classification made by many thinkers. One is antiquarian history, which tries to recreate the past. So in this methodology, we ignore the present and we say that what had happened in the past would happen in future. So this is antiquarian historiography. And there is also another type of historiography, otherwise known as monumental histography, which looks at the past for models of how to act in the present, ignoring the novelty of the present and diminishing the significance of the present agents. This is the monumental historiography. And the third is the critical historiography, which takes into account the role of the present as well as the future. Though S.S. Barlingay, sir, comes very close to this third kind of historiography, that is a critical historiography, we have to understand him as a philosopher of history who could talk about the role of participants. Because when he talks about the progressive humanism, he is of the view that all participants must play their role in history. That is the reason why in postmodern tradition we ask the question, what is my role in history? Somebody has written some history, of course I read it, but where do I place myself? If I am not reflected in that history, then what is the use of studying that history? When we talk about the European history, what is my role? Where do I exist there? Do I exist there or not? That is a question. So he talks about the role of participants, which is very important, which can make a meaningful historiography. So you can see how he develops the concept of historiography from Indian perspective. And quite often it is said that Indian historiography is different from Western historiography, no doubt. Now, Indian historiography, the tradition plays a very important role. Nobody can deny that. So, in fact, it is argued by many contemporary thinkers that the Indian historiography starts with the Vedas and the Vedic literature. There is nothing wrong in starting the Indian historiography with the Vedas and the Vedic tradition, which is very important. For example, the Idiasas and Puranas are the real and rich store of historical facts. In fact, I would say that there are many resemblances between the Greek word historia and the Sanskrit word Idiasa, which is referred to as story and history, tale, narration, as well as the events that are narrated and told. The Herodotus, a well-known Greek thinker, says that we come across a great variety of reports and events observed by the customs of the other people, which has to be understood seriously, which has to be taken seriously. Now, it is very much essential for us to make a distinction here between a tale and a history. Can a tale make the history? That is a question. So when we are talking about Vedic historiography, it is also necessary to look and see whether there is something prior to Vedic culture. This is very much essential in order to trace the origin and development of Indian historiography. And also there are thinkers who talk about the religious historiography. Religious historiography. Now, what do we mean by that? Religious historiography. And when we are writing history through religion or using religious, the significance of religion, then it becomes religious historiography. There is nothing, according to me, there is nothing wrong in developing a religious approach to history. Why should we think about that religious approach to history when it has no connection with our life? I would like to quote here Professor D.P. Chattopadhyaya, late Professor D.P. Chattopadhyaya, who in his very interesting paper, Idiasa, History and Historiography of Civilization, is a very, very important paper. This is published in JICPR, wherein he talks about various types of historiography, like Buddhist historiography, Muslim historiography, Hindu historiography, humanist historiography, natural historiography, and so on. And he argues that a study of Buddhist historiography explains how the history of different orthodox schools of Indian philosophy cannot be reconstructed, right, without reference to Buddha. So this methodology is something remarkable. The D.P. Chattopadhyaya's approach to historiography is something remarkable. And also it is said by D.P. Chattopadhyaya that when compared to the Hindus, the Muslims had been more history conscious. And he says thinkers like MacDonald, A.B. Gates, W.C. Smith also say that the Hindus have very little interest in recording the past. It's a very, very important point. Keith says that the indifferent to chronology is everywhere in India. And he says, further says, the Hindus always made the distinction between a private, a private event and the historical event, and every care was taken by them not to include any private events in the history. So perhaps this made them to pay less attention to history. So this is one of the important aspect which we have to take into account while talking about Indian historiography. Now, further, while talking about the nature of historiography, Barlingay says that history has always been approached from three different perspectives. One way of looking at history is that the past was much better than the present, and the future will be worse as there is a gradual deterioration. This, of course, we know this is a creation theory of history, which is based on the yugas, which is based on faith, of course. Then this is one way of understanding historiography, that is the creation theory of history. And the second theory of history is the evolutionary theory of history, wherein it is said the past was primitive and the present has great advantage on the past and the future will be better as there is a gradual progress. This is otherwise known as the evolutionary theory of history, wherein it is said there is a constant progress. And the third perspective is very important because it is otherwise known as the development theory of history, wherein it is said that there is neither progress nor regress. And the reason is that progress and regress are purely temporal and regional. So this way of understanding historiography has been mentioned by Barlingay, and further he says that we have to see the role of history in the context of development. It is necessary, he says, it is necessary for Indian historiographers to talk about the past or rethink about the past so that they can shape the future in a better way. Here, I would like to give one example how the past is very much essential. One has to reenact the thought of past. The writing I would take from Croce, the philosopher Croce. He asks this question: do you want to understand the true history of a blade of grass? I'll repeat, do you want to understand the true history of a blade of grass? Try to become a blade of grass. And if you cannot do it, satisfy yourself with analyzing its parts and even arranging them in a sort of ideal or fanciful history, unquote. Similarly, Professor Collingwood, while defining history, says that it is not history of successive events. It is the unfolding of the mind of the historical thinker and effort of self-study. Just now we have seen in Foucault that history is always discontinuous. Now, when we are reading history as a mere successive events, then we are trying to history as a one history or a continuous history or a conjuncture history, which is not acceptable. So successive, when we are mentioning about mere successive events, it is only chronicle and it is not history. So this methodology of Collingwood is something very much visible in the writings of the postmodern historiography as well as the writings of S.S. Barlingay. Now, another important question which is raised by Professor Barlingay with regard to historiography is biography a history? And he says the biography cannot be the history for the main reason that it is not authentic always. Toynbee also long back said that in biography there is always a glorification of somebody, whereas history gives a true history, true in quotes. So biography is not history because its limits are the biological events. It talks about the birth and death of a human organism. So in this way, S.S. Barlingay points out that biography cannot be the history. So what he was trying to say all the time is that there is a need for reconstruct the past, and while reconstructing the past, we can shape our future. Here, the progressive humanism is very important because he says that man, human being, has a constant way of approaching the future, which means there is always a progress in him which has to taken into account. Now, keeping this as a backdrop, let us see how Barlingay goes further. She says it is very much essential for us to include the interpretative approach to history, because interpretation is very much essential in order to see history from a new perspective. Because already we have seen that in history there is always a discontinuity. It is not mere successive events, one after the other coming. If that is a history, then it is a chronicle history. That is not acceptable. So there is a need for understanding history from a different perspective, which means we have to see how there is always an interpretative element which plays a significant role in understanding history. Now, Barlingay is not concerned with the question whether human being is a matter or spirit, because this is a very important issue that is debated in the Indian philosophical discourse, whether human being is a spirit or matter. But he has a different approach. He says whether man, human being is a matter or spirit, that is immaterial, but he has to be distinguished from other objects. Because man, he says, is conscious, and the beauty is that he is aware of the fact that he is conscious, that is self-conscious, as I said earlier. So this way of approach of Barlingay tries to understand historiography from a new perspective. And further he says that historiography is the product of intercommunicability. Now in phenomenological tradition, we talk about intersubjective understanding. Barlingay talks about the intercommunicability, which means in intercommunicability only human beings can understand each other. So here he talks about the relation that exists between the past, present, with that of the future, and he says that all three are interrelated. Man, he says, is always aware of the past, and also it is a fact that he cannot be aware of the future, but remodifying the past or re-understanding the past, he can aware of the future also. So the past, present, and future, all the three are interrelated in the writings of Barlingay. And also he considers human being as a historical being and not as a futuristic being. This, I think, is a very important contribution of Barlingay, for the reason that he could see how human being is closely related to the past and how he shapes his present, which will shape his future. So all three are interrelated. So he can't be a futuristic being. And in order to explain this, he takes example from Bhagavad Gita. He uses the text Bhagavad Gita, which says you have the ability to control your present actions, and you have no ability to shape the future events. By quoting this from Bhagavad Gita, he shows that the human being cannot be the futuristic being. And there is also a distinction he has already mentioned, which I already said, that there is a distinction between action and the author of action, and it cannot be separated because they always bundle into one, the action of the human being and author of the action. Both are always connected to one another. And further he says that human beings cannot neglect the role of the other. But when he talks about the intercommunicability, he talks about the significance of the other, and he says in the history or in the when as a historical being, I need the existence or the presence of the other. If I cannot communicate with other, then my existence and as a human being, he says, is incomplete. So this way of approach is something, I'll just see the time. This approach of Barlingay gives a new dimension to Indian historiography, because he believes that human being alone can understand the reality. He can shape the history. He's the one who can give a direction to history. So all this is possible because human beings alone possesses a self-consciousness. So this is something very important while reading the contribution of S.S. Barlingay. And finally, I would like to state how, in his approach to historiography, he analyzes thinkers like Tilak, Rahul Sankrityan, Tagore, K.M. Panikkar, Nehru, M.N. Roy, S.A. Dange, Lohia, Ambedkar, E.M.S. Namboodiripad, and S.S. Kosambi. He tries to understand historiography in this context. That is, history, according to him, is something which is unfolding of the essence of the man. This is a beautiful quotation of Professor Barlingay. History is the unfolding of the essence of man. So he says, in Western historiography, we come across thinkers like Bacon, Comte, Hegel, Marx, Toynbee, Sorokin, and others. But Indian side, he said it is high time for us to re-look into or re-understand our historiography by making a rereading of these thinkers, Indian thinkers, whom I mentioned just now. And his important contribution to historiography can be taken from Tilak's, Bal Gangadhar Tilak's important works like Orion, the Arctic home in the Vedas, then Gita Ragasya. These three important works he quotes considerably in order to show that how Indian historiography or philosophy of history has been shaped by Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He says Tilak method is to understand Indian historiography keeping Bhagavad Gita and other texts as the base. He says most of the time, Indian historiography is misunderstood by the foreigners by saying that it is nothing but mythology. But quoting Gita Ragasya of Tilak, Barlingay says that man cannot and should not remain without actions. And man and actions cannot be separated, which we have mentioned just now. So this methodology, which he has pointed out, that is in the writings of Tilak cannot be just read as, his writings cannot be read as a commentary to Gita. We have to contextualize the contribution of Tilak in order to show that Tilak does not speak about mythology. He is the one who develops the historiography, Indian historiography, in a beautiful way. And another creative history which he is talking about is the Nehruian methodology. One is the creative, one is a methodology which is discussed by Tilak. Okay. Then another important model of history is otherwise known as the creative model. These are both are creative models of history. So one is by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and another creative model of history is very much present, according to Barlingay, is very much present in the writings of Nehru, especially in his discovery of the world. Here he argues that while writing the work, that is a very beautiful passage. If you read that passage, you you would understand how he approaches Nehru from a different perspective. He says that while writing this book, Discovery of the World, Nehru was under a certain burden in quotes. History of the past certainly becomes a burden in a sense, according to Barlingay. But what is interesting is that he points out that Nehru emancipates himself or come out of this burden in a beautiful way. And Barlingay, I would like to quote here Barlingay. I quote, "Now there is a sense of belonging." And he means Nehru. Nehru looks history as unfolding of the vision of the future. It is a transition from burden to plan. This is very important. Burden to plan with the help of the power that man has acquired from history. Unquote. So, Barlingay could see how the concept of power and plan played a major role in the historiography of Nehru. And he says that the burden of Nehru, with regard to the past, carrying the burden of the past, he has moved from this burden to power and play. So this model, two models, the creative model, one is the Tilak model and the other is a Nehruvian model. They are the creative methods of philosophy of history or historiography, wherein one can see the creative role of human beings, which I think is an essential factor in historiography. Then apart from this, I will conclude in another 5 minutes perhaps. There is also another, apart from this creative model of history, where we place thinkers like Tilak and Nehru, we have also a critical model, right? Critical model. Barlingay places Kosambi in this category, and he says Kosambi's works like Culture and Civilization of Ancient India, and then Introduction to the Study of Indian History, and Myth and Reality, these works are clearly examined by Barlingay to show that these works are critical in nature. So this method of writing, that is critical method of writing history, is nothing but a critique of history. And he says, for Kosambi, social change is a very important factor in history, which means the socio-cultural history presupposes the theory of social change. So there is an interconnection between the socio-cultural history as well as social change. So his history is a history guided by a theory. So we can see in Kosambi, we can see a critical approach to history, which is based on social change. And in this context, he examines, that is, Barlingay examines the contribution of Lohia as the Indian philosopher of history. Because Lohia is a very important contemporary thinker, especially his work, The Wheel of History, is very important because it gives a unique approach to history. And Lohia rejects the Marxist as well as the Hegelian analysis of history, and argues that their methodology or their historiography is partial historiography or partial history. And Lohia further says that both, that is Marx as well as Hegel, have failed to comprehend the nature of man and solve the problem of a human being. How far this is true is a questionable one, but this is how he presents his views. But Lohia is of the view that there are different trends which one can see in the philosophy of history. First, history could be seen as a game, and further he says there is also one can look at history purely from the European model, which gives, he says, which gives a hope, but that hope, he says, is a naive hope. It's not a real hope, it's a pseudo hope. So he places the Marxian methodology as well as the 19th century political philosophy here, where there is an attempt to give hope to human beings. And the third methodology or the third trend which he talks about is the European model, wherein he places thinkers like Northrop, Sorokin, Spengler, Toynbee, and others. So this methodology, he says, is more realistic because their philosophical discourse has a close connection with that of the humanity. So in this way, Barlingay talks about the significance of great thinkers like Tilak, then Nehru, and then Lohia. And while talking about Lohia, further he says that with regard to Lohia, the future is poetic in nature and even utopian, and which is not acceptable to Barlingay. And he says it is, it does not mean that it is unscientific, but Lohia is of the view that the fusion of the material as well as the spiritual aspects of man must be properly understood. So if we ignore one aspect, then we cannot understand the other. So further, according to Barlingay, Lohia speaks about that every historical event must have the internal as well as external sides. So while talking about Lohia, his statement, that is Barlingay's statement, is very profound. I would like to quote: the internal side is concerned with the class and caste, and the external side is concerned with the composition amongst different societies and culture, unquote. So though Lohia admits that the caste has played an evil role, India at least has been able to overcome the color bias. The fusion of Indian society is the fusion of colors. I have a disagreement here, of course, but what we see, whether we have really overcome the color bias, is to be seen. Because the class structure, according to me, has played a great havoc in Indian society, and one cannot simply deny this or dismiss this. So in brief, one can say that the contributions made by Professor Barlingay is something novel. He talks about the notion of man as a historical being and give a conceptual analysis of understanding human being as a historical being. And also he talks about how a different account of Indian historiographers are very much available in Indian tradition. And it is high time for us to relook our Indian philosophical tradition and social and political philosophy also, in order to show that how the history can give us a direction. So in this way, he has given a new methodology for understanding Indian historiography, which of course quite often neglected by the Westerners, of course, but we don't have to bother for the Western historiography or the Western thinkers who talk about Indian historiography in a biased way, because our methodology is entirely different, and this methodology is very much prevalent in our ancient culture, tradition, and value, which has preserved the history as well as the human value. So S.S. Barlingay's methodology is something remarkable, and it gives us a new direction for the future. So with this, I would like to stop, and I am very grateful to the philosophy family for giving me this nice opportunity of sharing some of my views. And I once again, I'm grateful to all the my close friends and who have given a patient hearing in spite of their other commitments. It is nice of them to stay till the end of this program, and I am grateful to all of you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks so much, sir, for your thought-provoking presentation on the contextualizing Indian historiography. Sir, I would like to offer my gratitude for your comprehensive, conceptual, and technical approach in re-understanding Indian historiography. I don't want to make any summary of what you have said, and because you have very clearly presented the Indian historiography, and you have also uh, made a distinction between Indian historiography and with Western historiography. You have mentioned different kinds of historiography like traditional historiography, modern historiography, Indian historiography, Western historiography, and monumental historiography, critical historiography, religious historiography, authentic historiography, non-authentic historiography, and many more things, historiography of power, historiography of vision, historiography of region, so many things that I don't want to reflect on that. And you have mentioned that how progressive humanism is an important dimension of historiography. With this, you have also mentioned different dimensions of historiography, method of historiography, and the nature of historiography. And you have said how historiography is a product of intercommunality, and it is a critical interpretation of a real understanding of the past, and many more things that I don't want to tell. And you have also made the distinction between the critical model of history and the creative model of history. With this, I want to offer you gratitude for having a very technical session today, for technical session or a technical discussion, because I am very ignorant on the philosophy of Barlingay. And on many occasions, I listened from you regarding the philosophy of Barlingay in different seminars. Thanks so much for making a beautiful presentation of the philosophy of Barlingay today. And I may request Professor Dr. K. Umana Rao or Professor Pramod Kumar Das to carry on the interactive session. Hello, Professor Das. Pramod sir.
Sir, I'm outside, sir. Please, Professor Das will take
Yes,
the
yes. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, Professor Das.
Hello. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, please, sir.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, audible. Audible, sir, audible.
Pranam. I am really grateful to the speaker of this evening. The presentation was wonderful. Philosophy of Professor Barlingay. The way you advocated his philosophy from your heart and mind. Very well you explained the understanding of the dialectics. This understanding is the metaphysical understanding. From that, we can proceed to ethics, sociology, and other branches of knowledge. The fundamental understanding is the understanding of the dialectics, the opposites. You spoke about personal and interpersonal relationship, subjectivity and intersubjectivity, metaphysical and empirical, society and man, philosophy and practical life, self-consciousness and consciousness, fundamentalism and progressive thinking. So many. I have a long list. Fact and description of a fact, metaphysical and historical, practical or social, historiography and biography. These are all dialectics. One should have that much understanding that there are two possibilities. Number one. Number two is, one is dogmatic, static, and the other is progressive. Out of these two possibilities, one possibility is dogmatic and the other is progressive. Professor Barlingay is in favor of the progressive way, because man is rational, because man is intellectual, and that is true philosophy. Understanding the metaphysics should be applied in our practical life, otherwise it is valueless, otherwise it is not pragmatic, otherwise it cannot be social, otherwise we cannot have any historiography, no purpose of historiography. So it should be meaningful by living, practical living, by its practical application. Then comes the question of historiography, because it's an academic excellence, academic attempt to protect that fact as a memory, as the history, so that will inspire the future progress. And if this is an academic technique, you discussed many methods of protecting this or applying this process. Many methodologies, you don't talk about methodology of historiography. But the purpose is we have to apply the understanding of that dialectics. And from that we can have a very holistic spiritual society, good life of harmony, peace, compassion, love, sacrifice. We can have that society according to our metaphysics and our practical ethics. I understood this way, and we shall discuss later. Now I shall request Ranjit Ghosh, please have your observation.
Thank you, Professor Das. And as usual, Professor Paneerselvam has given a very detailed discussion of Professor S.S. Barlingay's philosophy. So this reminds me about the seminars some 40 years back. I am going back in time, where Professor Barlingay and Professor Dayakrishna taking stands in one side, and in the other, Professor Pahi and Professor Sundararajan, they are taking the opposite camp. And in fact, I have attended many seminars, because Professor Barlingay and Professor Sundararajan both were good friends of Professor Dayakrishna, and they used to come always in Jaipur, and we were mostly invited and discussed many things with him. Now, the thing is, what is important is Dayakrishna and Barlingay, they were against the systematization in philosophy. They were always trying to give a creative, imaginative situation. And for that reason, as Professor Selvam has right now mentioned, that he has taken the phenomenological stance of giving importance to imagination. So these things are reflected in Professor Daya's philosophy as well, because Dayakrishna has tried to develop a creative philosophizing, and he always proposed an open texture of thought. And this actually is similar to Professor Barlingay's philosophy, as I have understood him. That means, because insight makes something alive always, and it drives us towards truth. And therefore, we should not be bound by any system. So, open texture of thought, this was the language Professor Dayaji used to mention in his philosophical speculation always. Now, what I have got today, a very nice elucidation about progressive humanism, because in Indian context, we are discussing different types of humanism, and the radical humanism, the other types of humanism which is coming from the south, humanism of Din Dayal Upadhyay's humanism. So this is a new type of humanism as exposed by
Professor Paneerselvam. And here one thing, as I have got, if I'm wrong, Professor, please clarify me, that he is trying to apply the net model where the pluralism is recognized and the importance of others is recognized. So for that reason, he is proposing a progressive humanism that is a type of his historiography can be identified as a progressive humanism, I should say. Now, one thing I could not, please make me clarified about one thing. At the last discussion of your version on the philosophy of Lohia, where you are trying to say that when Lohia rejects both Hegel and Marx, and he tries to bring a fusion of the material and the spiritual. And for that reason, we also can brand him as a creative historiographer. And also as like Tilak and Nehru's discovery of India and Tilak's Gita Rahasya, as you have mentioned. So these are all the creative aspects of the historiography I have mentioned. So in this context, interpretative approach to history is whether, my question is this, that has he not, Professor Barlingay, he has never bothered about the chronicle history of philosophy, but always adopted an interpretative approach of philosophy with a tinge of imagination. This is my question. Thank you.
Sir, can I ask a question? I am Nilambar Chakraborty.
Can I answer this, or I'll take all questions? I don't know what is the methodology you follow. Can I answer, Professor Ghosh?
Yes, sir. Carry on, sir. Carry on.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Ranjit Ghosh, sir, for your wonderful observation. And it is always a pleasure to listen to your comments and valuable observation. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very happy that you belonging to our generation. Can I say old generation? Hope you will not mind. You had an association with the great thinkers like Dayakrishna, Sundararajan, Barlingay, and many others. So you would be definitely remembering, like me, that how wonderful those days were. How these thinkers would give a different approach to philosophical problems. And as you really pointed out that how Dayaji was talking about philosophizing. So usually, I'm just telling this for our younger friends. Those days, in a seminar, these stalwarts, when they speak, we can listen to them hours together, and there were very beautiful things which would come out from these great thinkers. So I remember, like you, I was remembering the olden days whenever I think of these, great philosophers. Now, you are right that these philosophers, in fact, Professor Ghosh, I would like to state that I would like to call them as recent Indian philosophers. Because I always make a distinction between contemporary Indian philosophers and recent Indian philosophers. And on some other occasion also I spoke about that. The recent Indian philosophers means those who are with us or who left us very recently, and their contribution is something novel. And because the contemporary philosophy starts from Brahma Samaj onwards. So we have to talk about our own thinkers who have contributed. So you are right that these great thinkers have talked about the need for rejecting the systematization of philosophy. This is something very remarkable, and Daya is a very good example. And for like Daya, for Barlingay are also philosophy means, as I said, it is philosophizing. It is not reading some text or some thinker. No, you would never accept that. And I mentioned the book of the Barlingay sir, that is Re-Understanding Indian Philosophy. In that book, as you know, he talks about how there is a need for reinterpreting some of the Indian philosophical concepts. So he gives a new direction or new methodology. And so we are not bounded by any system. So the system building philosophy has to be transcended. I won't say that it has to be rejected, but there is a need for us to re-understand philosophical concepts. So a new methodology is very much important. And with regard to the net model, yeah, you are right. The net model talks about the progressive humanism. As you rightly said, that the entire philosophical discourse of Barlingay surely takes us to this new humanism, which is progressive in nature, and that wherein he places human being or man as the center, and he talks about how that man has to work for his future, for the betterment of the society. That's why he talks about intercommunicability, intersubjectivity, and all that one. So I would say that phenomenological method is very much present, though he has not mentioned that because no, that moment was not that much familiar during that time. And also Logia, yeah, I always have a very great admiration for Logia. But when S.S. Barlingay sir talks about his methodology as a critical method, it has to be critical for the main reason that he says that the methodology of Karl Marx or Hegel are not really progressive, which is I in my talk also I pointed out whether this can be accepted is a debatable one. So yeah, we can call it as creative historiography also, no doubt. But why it is said critical? Because this is a word used by Barlingay when he talks about Logia. He says he classifies the critical model and the creative model, and he says Logia he places Logia under critical because it is critical in the sense that he shows the limitation of Karl Marx as well as Hegel. So perhaps in that context we can say it is critical, but it is also a creative model. And I would say all our historiographers, at least most of them, I would say, have given a creative model only. And then, then another important issue which you raised is about interpretation or the chronicle side of history. I would say that always history needs some element of interpretation, because otherwise it becomes a biography or it becomes nothing but a successive events one after another continuously. So we are not concerned about that. We are talking about how the element of interpretation is playing a dominant role in history. In fact, here I have to point out in this essay, he talks about I forgot to mention that had Hitler won the war, Second World War, then history would have been different. Because many historians would have celebrated him and they would have given us a new theory that his methodology or his historiography is something remarkable. So it all depends on how you look at the history, but it needs some element of interpretation so that it can be related to our life. It can modify our nature. It can help us to progress further. So I feel that the interpretation element is very much there in any history. There cannot be any history without interpretation. It is not possible, according to me. I may be wrong also, I don't know. Thank you very much, Professor Ghosh, for
Sir, but one thing, so what about Toynbee's history? Toynbee's history is chronicle or interpretative? Arnold Toynbee's.
This is a very important question, but I would say that it is a history which is very continuous. So he's talking about history as not as an interpretive history. Interpretive history is needed because we are trying to develop this interpretive history in order to show that for human progress something is needed, so history has to be interpreted.
Interpretive history needs transcendence, which is not available in Toynbee, and may be available in Discovery of India to some extent.
Yeah.
The thing. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Oh, Alokji.
May I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Alokji.
Namaskar. How are you? I could not, very sorry, could not hear you because I had to visit my doctor and I am just came out of his clinic. But I have an observation to make, so I may not be very profound and comprehensive like you, as you have taken up a very new topic, and that I liked very much because Professor Barlingay was not in the mode of, you can say, that academic philosophers limiting himself to certain issues or certain problems only. He will talk about everything. So meeting him once in his residence, I could get his blessings and all that. And he called me just to come to Pune for the World Philosophical Meet and forget about everything. So I just visited that place, and that memory still lingers with me. And there I could get the feel of what philosophy is and what world philosophy is, what Indian philosophy is. And I got many friends which are still my friends. So that was a great experience for me. And I always salute him because he sent a small postcard when I completed my PhD to congratulate me. So I was really, what I should say, to completely, no words can express that. Anyway, but in your presentation, you gave this opportunity, so I must read some of the this particular paper of Barlingay. That will be very interesting because he is talking about the modern Indian thinkers. Some may argue that they are not philosophers, but my observation is that when you take Foucault as a model and say that previous historians have not given enough credit to the people who were subjugated in history, I think this is wrong. This may be because when we think about Marx, we cannot say that Marx did not consider the plight of the subjugated laborers in the historical setup of capitalism. One thing. Second point, what I want to say is that this whole lot of thinkers which you have talked about, from Nehru, Koshambi, Lohiya, all these, they do not seem to come into a group belonging to postmodern thought or thinkers or the Foucault's way of looking at history. They might have not agreed with Marx and Hegel about the telos of history, but their own understanding of history is, I think, very much different from the postmodern understanding of history. And the third point which I want to raise is that this Professor Barlingay, when he talks about humanism, I think this humanism is not very popular with postmodernists. So to categorize Professor Barlingay with those postmodern thinkers, I think this seems to be a bit problematic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lokji, for your wonderful observations and questions. Now,
so can I ask a similar continue with the same kind of question I'm just having? So can I continue with that, or should I wait for after your answer?
Can I answer him first and then we'll take your question?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Madam? Okay. Now, with regard to Alokji's very interesting observation, what I wanted to say was that it was Foucault who could talk about the subjugated knowledge. Of course, Marx, nobody can deny the great contribution made by Marx with regard to people who are subjugated and all that one. But Foucault, while writing the historiography, points out that from the Greek period up to the 20th century philosophy, this is a prevalent notion. That is, we are trying to look at history as a continuous one. That's the reason why he calls it as a conventional history or traditional historiography, wherein there is always the neglect of some people. There is always rejection of the other. So I'm using this Foucaultian model in order to show that there is also another way of reading or rereading history. I never can underestimate the great contribution made by Marx with regard to that. But Foucault, I've taken a model in order to show that the entire tradition of the Western philosophical discourse is based on that. Then I was trying to examine our Indian thinkers whom he has pointed out, like Kosambi, Rahul Sankridyan, K.M. Panikkar, and others, in order to show how these thinkers have developed Indian historiography. I think I have not argued that these people support the postmodern historiography. No. What I was trying to show was that these philosophers have developed their own methodology in order to promote what is known as Indian historiography. But the question, hope you would remember this, I said that where do we place, Barlingay? Whether there are two ways of understanding historiography. One is a traditional way of understanding historiography. Then another is I was trying to, because using Foucaultian model, I was trying to show that that is postmodern understanding of historiography. And I argued that there cannot be a place for traditional historiography in Barlingay. So let us you see this method, and he comes very close that. But there are, I won't say that what all postmodernists have said has been anticipated by Barlingay. No, that is not my contention. Some elements could be drawn from this postmodern historiography, and that could be seen. The elements perhaps we can see, because we can say it is a parallel that could be drawn. So this Indian historiographers have not talked about their historiography or Indian historiography by using the postmodern historiography. That is not my contention. And moreover, this progressive humanism, it is something new, because he always, well, in the context of history, he says that there should be a progress. The past, present, and future, three are interrelated, and the future should be based on what has happened in the past and the present. So we call it as a progressive humanist, because he's the one who keeps a human being or man as a center. Man as a center, man is the center. So this methodology would make him as the progressive humanist. Progressive humanism is a philosophical term which we assign to his methodology. And in fact, he himself says that he is a progressive humanist. Thank you very much, Alokji, for your wonderful observation and question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Alokji. Nice. Thank you, you could participate. Professor Jayanti, madam.
It was difficult.
Yes, sir,
okay, thank you.
Can I ask?
Yes, Professor Jayanti.
Sir, good evening, sir. So
Good evening.
it's so wonderful to listen to a very insightful and informative lecture regarding history of Indian philosophy. We have never seen a text written on, when we talk about Indian philosophy, a kind of historical perspective. You can read Indian philosophy. So that was always a question to my mind, that why we don't write history of Indian philosophy and we teach the students in that direction. And listening to it is a very wonderful, and so many clarity still I need, because sir, there is a problem when you talk about understanding Indian philosophy through traditional, you have given a traditional approach, understanding historiography, and also the modern approach, and also the postmodern approach. The problem here arises if we see that man is a conscious being. You also rightly point out that history of that man is a conscious being, and then you continue to that modernism. If we go like Hegelian model, you gave that man as a self-conscious being and the rational being. But then like Professor Tandon also said, that when we come to a Foucault model, then you point out there is a discontinuity, and if that discontinuity is there, then how can we establish a progressive model? That is my first question. Can we go back to Lyotard, as he said, as a postmodern scholar, that postmodernism is a continuation of modernism? So that is the second point that I need a clarification there. And then you also spoke about the plurality, and now how this plurality will be retained through the historical method, historical method which you spoke. And you also said that philosophy needs to be contextualized, and so far as interpret history as it interpretation, then that is fine, but it's very difficult to accept that history is a history of interpretation, though we philosophers do that. And if we go by context, rurality, then discontinuity, then do you think that we can retain the progressive model which we are talking about in case of Barlingay, Professor Barlingay? And that is the second thing. And the third final is that, do you think that Nehruvian model will a kind of holistic model we can establish in order to establish the Indian philosophical thinking? So that's clarification, sir, because I don't have much knowledge, so that I needed just clarification. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Professor Jayanti Sahugi, for two reasons. I must thank you. The first reason is this. You gave me a helping hand when my talk was slated last month, though I agreed I could not be there. So I could see that you replaced me by giving your talk during that time. This has really helped me, so I am grateful to you. In fact, I have been thinking about that. And second, this thing is for raising so many issues. I'll try to answer some of them at least. Now, with regard to history of Indian philosophy, I feel that it is Dasgupta who has written the history of Indian philosophy. So, in fact, when we talk about the great writings of Radhakrishnan, Indian Philosophy Volume 1, we always make a distinction between Radhakrishnan's contribution and Dasgupta's contribution. One talks about the history or the development of Indian philosophy from the Vedic time onwards. But on the other hand, if you look at Radhakrishnan, he has given the philosophical concepts wherein he talked about how a philosophical concept in Indian tradition is equivalent with that of the West. So this is one way of understanding philosophy, but I have some reservation with regard to this mode of understanding of Indian philosophy. So there is a proper way of understanding which is very much available in Dasgupta, I think. But long back these books have been written, and it is high time for us to re-understand or reinterpret Indian philosophical tradition. This is my view. And many scholars also subscribe to this view. And I think the need of the hour is to re-understand or to reinterpret Indian philosophical tradition. And secondly, the traditional historiography and modern historiography. Now, and also you made a distinction, this postmodern understanding. In fact, I just wanted to retain two models only. One is traditional historiography and other is modern or postmodern, though there is a distinction between. For sake of clarity, I would like to make the distinction. In traditional historiography, it is said that what had happened in the past would happen in future also. That is, so it is continuous and there cannot be any change. This kind of historiography will not give us any progressive idea, because it is something like believing that what had happened in the past would happen in future also. There is so man plays a minimum role. But in the modern or the postmodern, there is a difference. But I am using this in this way in order to show that when they talk about historiography, they say there are a discontinuity or there is a break among history. So this would help us, because this gives a chance. I'm using Foucault. Foucault may be right or wrong, I don't know. I am using this model in order to show this methodology would give us to point out some of the deficiencies of the traditional method of doing historiography. So this is one thing. And also it has been pointed out by Professor Barlingay, then when man becomes conscious, because man is the center, the very beautiful approach of Barlingay is that he keeps man as the center of history, and he says man is conscious. And not only that, if he is aware of the fact that he is self-conscious, that itself gives him an identity. So every human being needs this identity that is possible only through this self-consciousness. Then secondly, if there is a discontinuity in history, then how can we have progress? This is one thing, question which you have asked, I think. Yeah, there can be a progress even with this discontinuity in history, because it is not the history, the progress is not mainly based on continuity or discontinuity of history. It all depends on how the history gives you information or how you understand history, the past, present, and future. So it is continuous. That process is continuous. So when that process, the past, present, and future, as Gadamer has very rightly pointed out, the past, present, and future are interrelated and interconnected. There is a continuity, and that continuity would take me to the progressive methodology. Or in that context, one can say that there is always a progress. And then you said plurality. Why? This plurality is to be celebrated. And we have been pointing out that it is very much essential for us to see that that plurality is one of the important factors which cannot be neglected. It has to be celebrated. This has been emphasized in many of the postmodern thinkers, as well as our ancient thinkers. In fact, in ancient philosophy, we talk about the concept of I and we. In fact, when Westerners talk about I and thou, I also said this in some previous meeting. The Western thinkers talk about the distinction between I and you, or I and thou. But in Indian tradition, we talk about the concept of we. So the plurality is a celebrated notion in Indian tradition. So that gives a methodology for understanding, Barlingay's historiography. The Nehruvian method, this is a very interesting method, like that of Balgang Tilak's methodology, because both are creative method. And why Barlingay is praising this Nehruvian methodology is that he very rightly says that in this methodology of Nehru, there is a progress. What is that progress? From burden, we have gone to progress and power. So this movement, this transition that is taking place from burden to progress and power is something very much essential. So this method also can be accepted. This also can be considered as a creative model, and that's why Barlingay accepts this Nehruvian method or model as a proper method of understanding history or historiography, because he says it is a creative historiography like that of Tilak. Then contextualizing. Yeah, contextualizing is very much essential for philosophical approach, because no, we can't simply discuss, no, especially after the the philosophical schools, like, philosophical methods like hermeneutics, one can say that contextualizing is very important. You read something and we try to show how that particular concept can be understood by relating it to other related concepts, and also see how far it is acceptable to me. For example, you differ from one another. So in darshan also, when we define philosophy by saying it is darshana or darshan, it gives a comprehensive picture of the reality. And I am very comfortable with the term darshana, because it is inclusive of each and every concept. It is comprehensive in nature. But in the case of, the term philosophy, I always have this difficulty. What is that? Because once we define philosophy by saying that it is love of knowledge or wisdom, that was fine. In fact, that's how we teach our students in the class. When they first enter into the class, we say it is philosophia, love of knowledge or wisdom. But when Wittgenstein came to the philosophical scene, then philosophy means for him the critique of language, right? Then the hermeneuticians, when they came to the philosophical scene, then it means the philosophy means discourse, wherein we participate. It is not simply we listen to some theory or some school of thought or somebody's speech. We try to participate. This is very important. So this is, this definition, this understanding of the term philosophy, which is used by the West, is so broad and so, of course, it is very good and very, it is very much acceptable. But I will be more comfortable with the term philosophy as darshana, because it gives a comprehensive picture of the entire reality. This is how I would like to make a distinction between these two, but I don't find any major distinction between these two. Perhaps our Indian way of understanding reality is better than that of the Westerners or the Western tradition. That's what I would like.
Sir, one clarification here.
Okay.
So if you, in Indian context, when we talk about darshan is tagged with the liberation. But when we talk of philosophy, it is not associated with any such thing. So you see that the samyak darshan sampanna karma bhinna nibaddhayate darshanena vihinastu sansaram pratipadyate. So if that is the thing in Indian context, then we know that it is associated with something. But in philosophy, it is not that. So how would you say this?
So, Professor Ranjit ji, thankful to you. But I don't want to reduce the term darshan with mere liberation. It has got a wider connotation, according to me. So it talks about the individual as well as the society, or transformation of the individual. Everything is included. Of course, moksha or liberation is one component which is celebrated in Indian tradition. But there are also other ways of understanding the term darshan, which means it is inclusive of everything. It need not be transcendental all the time. It can talk about the empirical also, but there is nothing wrong if it talks about transcendental. In fact, it is talking about transcendental. So I would like to give a comprehensive understanding of the term darshan, so that everything can be placed in this term darshan.
Can we say it is experiential? Can we say darshan is something which is experiential? Can we say that?
All philosophical approach or discourse is experiential, I would say. But I would like to state that Indian philosophers, especially the classical as well as contemporary, as well as the recent philosophers, because I make the three distinctions, all these philosophers have a concern for the development of the individual, the progress of the individual. So all philosophers from the ancient time onwards in India, we can see the historicity, we can see the role of tradition, we can see the role of culture, right? So these aspects are very much essential. So philosophy in India is very much experiential, but sometimes you are right, in the Western tradition it is not experiential. Because sometimes there are some schools of thought which talks about some abstract concepts which has no relevant with the present day of human life, but in Indian tradition it is not so. Every concept which our Indian philosophers from the time of our great rishis and sages, which we can see, it has got a relevant to our life. Everything has a bearing on human life. So it is experience, no doubt.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, sir. Thank you. Thank you. I was listening. I'm traveling, sir. People around. I cannot. Okay. Thank you, Professor Paneerselvam, sir. I was listening to you.
Yeah,
okay, sir.
Thank you, Professor Narayan Rao. Thank you, Professor Narayan Rao.
Sir, nothing to say today, sir, because I'm traveling people around and I cannot speak. Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for listening to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dashar, for your kind observation. In fact, you made a very beautiful distinction between the dogmatic and progressive, and also pointed out that how harmony is very much important for human beings. And you have been stressing this point in all your programs, in all your observations. Thank you very much. And also, I personally thank you for giving me this nice opportunity. And also, I congratulate you for doing a wonderful service to the philosophical community. And I personally feel that I don't have words to thank you for your wonderful and remarkable contribution by arranging lectures in this philosophical family. My humble pranams to you and Professor Narayan Rao and other friends, Rana and others who are doing a wonderful service to this philosophy family. Thank you very much.
Grateful, sir. Grateful. Really, we are grateful. Philosophy family is grateful to sir. We are also grateful to Professor Alexander Indy, Professor and others who really enjoy this program and participate. We forget time, we transcend time, transcend gap when we are involved in our studies. Thank you for having a good time, having your good sharing, and having your life. Thank you.
Thank you.